my friends. It's Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. And in the last couple of episodes this week, as we've been getting toward the end of Matthew chapter 23, there's been a lot of passion because there's a lot of passion in the text, and there's just no nice way to slice it. Jesus is having his very direct, ultimate, public, final, verbal confrontation with the enemies of the redemptive plan. That is the religious leaders, the Pharisees. They're extra super disappointing because it's supposed to be their job to help people understand the redemptive plan and to keep an eye out for the redemptive plan and to connect people with the redemptive plan. But Jesus is charging that they do the exact opposite, and that for all of their long lineage, intellectually and spiritually, tracing back centuries to their particular class of religious leadership, they've always got it wrong. They've opposed the prophets at every turn. They've killed the prophets. And in the passage that we've been looking at, Jesus, in keeping with the parable that he told there at the end of chapter 22, he's effectively saying, you killed all the prophets who've been sent before. Now the king, God, has sent his own son to say, surely these tenants whose job it is to take care of this project I have going will respond well to my own son. But in the parable from the end of 22, those tenants don't respond better to the son. They're even more opportunistic and angry in response to the son, and they kill him, thinking that now they can take full control of the entire operation around here. And so Jesus is intoning, you killed everybody he sent before. Now he sent his son. You're going to kill me too. And further, you're going to kill the people who I send who come next. So that's been tough language, and we've spent a lot of time on it. And I thought we could use a little pseudo-academic aside to go and track down a question that is buried in here that is really kind of off topic, because this particular question doesn't necessarily drill down deeper onto what all of Matthew 23 is about. This particular question takes us off in a different direction about the reliability of the text and how Matthew and even Luke recorded and assembled their details, how they order their chronology, and what you do when you run into stuff that is ambiguous or hard to sort out regarding the New Testament interaction with the Old Testament history. Here's what I'm driving at. In the very home stretch of this home stretch closing argument that Jesus is making, that I liken to like a lawyer in a courtroom, in verse 35, he says this, and so upon you will come all the righteous blood that has been shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Now, the challenge here is not in figuring out what Jesus' point is. Jesus' point here is super, super, super simple. Abel would clearly be the first martyr. Remember, Cain killed him. There weren't really other humans on earth before that to be a candidate for martyrdom. Nobody could possibly debate that whether you read the Bible as a beautiful pseudo-fictional work that points to humans trying to make sense of the origin story, or whether you view it as the inspired word of God that is accurate, either way, in this story, Abel is the first person to get killed for being righteous and doing what is right. So no debate there, very, very simple. And then Jesus is suggesting that this Zechariah character, who we need to talk about a lot more, is the last in some scope of vision, some spectrum, some timeline. And so the idea here is, hey, you Pharisees, you religious leaders, and your historical ilk, from the very beginning, your impulse and people with it has been murderous toward righteous people, including the first martyr, Abel, all the way up to the very, very end of the scriptures and the last martyr, that is the last prophet to be killed by your ilk, Zechariah. So he's hitting this closing argument and say, you guys own it all. Every last drop of all of that blood, it is on you. You have brought this judgment upon yourselves. You have damaged other people in the process of this. It's wholesale condemnation, and they don't escape judgment for even 1 ounce of this evil that started at the very beginning of the story and runs all the way to the very end of the story. But a quick Google search, wait, no, I'm not saying Google search anymore. Nobody's giving me money to say this. A quick DuckDuckGo search on my Brave browser, because they're way better on all of the privacy stuff, will reveal that Zechariah, I mean, it doesn't look like he got martyred at the end of the Old Testament. It looks like he got martyred at like the middle mark of the Old Testament. And we're talking about 2 Chronicles 24. So, okay, let me just turn over here and hold up my Bible and see how close that is. Yeah, that's like maybe halfway through the Old Testament. If you know, it's like 40% of the way through the Old Testament. How can that be considered the end? What's Jesus talking about here? Okay, Well, the first of the problems is very easily solved. Abel, obviously that's going to be at the very beginning of any ordering of the books of the Old Testament, and chronologically, it's going to be at the very beginning. But the order of the books of the Old Testament after the first 5, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, it gets a little sketchy. It changes over time. If you're looking at anywhere between a few hundred years before the time of Christ all the way up to a few hundred years after, Jews and Christians at no point amongst themselves have this clear locked-in order of Old Testament books. They get arranged in different groups at different times, and that's not a problem. Nobody from Judaism or Christianity would be like, the order of the books is inspired, and if you don't read them in this order, that's totally screwed up, bro. You have to. It makes perfect logical sense that the Pentateuch would go first because it covers the origin of things and the beginning of the deal between God and humankind. It sets up the story arc of the serpent that comes to wreck the glorious creation of God and God's decision to say, no, I'm not going to go along with that. I'm going to fight back against this. And in fact, I'm going to triumph. And there's the promise of this one who will crush the head of the serpent. And that is the narrative arc for all of existence, all of history. God redeems what is broken in his creation at his own expense, and eventually at the expense of the blood of his own son, Jesus of Nazareth. So even though it's not like ordained or mandatory, it just makes sense. You got to put that at the beginning in order to understand the rest of the stuff that happens in the Old Testament. But after that, how do you lay that out? Do you make the Old Testament the kind of thing that's just chronologically, this psalm was written here, so it goes here, but then some time passed and some stuff from Samuel and Kings and Chronicles happened in here, and then this other psalm was written? I mean, we have modern chronological Old Testaments where people try to do that, and that's nice if you're trying to read it as a history book, but then that divorces everything from the movements and themes and motifs, and you lose all of those touches and callbacks like you and I have experienced throughout the book of Matthew. So you really can't carve it up like that either. It's going to be achronological to some extent as you lump the different genres together. And so effectively in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament that would have been in circulation, that everybody was reading at the time of Christ, that would have been read in synagogues and whatnot, you would have had 2 Chronicles as the last book of the Old Testament. In 2 Chronicles 24, starting in verse 20, where we get the account of the forerunners of the Pharisees killing yet another prophet. This, depending on how you read it, looks like it is the final such act committed in the book of 2 Chronicles, and thus also the final such act in the entire document that Jews at this time would have regarded as the scriptures. So acknowledging that we definitely have record of different ways of organizing the Old Testament, the most common understanding would have been that the Zechariah of 2 Chronicles is the final martyr, the final prophet proper to get killed in this way in the Old Testament, or the Jewish scriptures as it was. So again, then, Jesus' intended meaning is just super easy. All of it, anywhere you go and look in the entire scriptures that you guys have in front of you, any violence done against a prophet, it's done by people who are from the same spiritual, intellectual tradition as you, and you can, according to Matthew 23, go and throw wreaths on their graves all you want. You can dress up those tombs and make them look pretty and talk about how terribly, terribly sad and tragic it is that those great prophets of old are gone now and how sad what happened to them is. But you guys are the same thing. You're doing the same thing. All of the impulses and selfishness and opposition to God that drove them then drives you now, and you're about to act in the exact same way in the grandest of matters, in a way that even puts to shame the worst behavior of the people from back then. You're about to take it all the way to its logical end. And in Matthew 23:32, just a little bit before the passage we're looking at, I think this is what he means when he says, fill up then the measure of the sin of your forefathers. So given the context, what Jesus means by this passage is very, very simple. You own it all. However, as I was referencing earlier, Abel, well, that beginning bracket of this equation is very, very easy and undisputable. Zechariah, on the other hand, is way, way, way trickier, and I already burned us through all of our time. So we're going to talk about why that's tricky next time around, and also you'll be glad to know that my daughter is unscarred. She seems fine, like perky, peppy, happy. She's got a great sense of humor, big, bright smile. It would seem that her time in captivity under the porch yesterday has done nothing to break her spirit, and if anything, only emboldened her all the more as someone who knows that she can cleverly find ways to overcome her problems. My goodness, I'm proud of her, and if you have no idea what I'm talking about, you should definitely go back and listen to yesterday's episode when all of that got covered. More on this Zechariah business mañana. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.